As I stepped out of my old pickup truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this sleepy little town. I'd been called to investigate a series of bizarre murders that had been terrorizing the residents. But as I walked down the deserted main street, I couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that hung in the air. The only sound was the distant cawing of crows and the gentle rustling of autumn leaves in the wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze. I'd seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things in my line of work as a monster hunter, but something about this place felt different. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with an unnatural energy, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I made my way towards the local police station, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a shop window. My weathered face stared back at me, the scars and tattoos that adorned my skin a testament to the countless battles I'd fought against the forces of darkness. But even with all my experience, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something far more sinister than anything I'd faced before. The police station was a small, unassuming building that looked like it had seen better days. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, I was greeted by a wave of stale air and the faint scent of coffee and cigarettes. The officer behind the front desk looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. I flashed my badge, a silver emblem that identified me as a member of a secret organization dedicated to hunting down supernatural threats. The officer's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm here about the murders," I said, my voice low and steady. "I need to see the bodies." The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded and gestured for me to follow him. As we made our way down a dimly lit hallway, he filled me in on the details of the case. "We've had 5 deaths so far," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "All of them were found in their homes, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. It's like nothing I've ever seen before." I nodded, my mind already racing with possibilities. I'd seen plenty of gruesome crime scenes in my time, but something about the officer's description sent a chill down my spine. As we entered the morgue, the smell of death and decay hit me like a physical force. I'd long since grown accustomed to the stench, but even I had to take a moment to compose myself before approaching the bodies laid out on the cold metal tables. What I saw there made even my battle-hardened stomach churn. The victims' bodies were a mess of torn flesh and shattered bone, their skin mottled and discolored in ways that suggested something far more sinister than a simple murder. But it was the strange, insectoid protrusions that caught my eye. Chitinous spines and razor-sharp mandibles that seemed to have burst forth from the victims' bodies like some kind of nightmarish metamorphosis. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing as I examined the wounds. I'd never seen anything like this before, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary killer. This was something far more ancient and evil, a creature that had no place in the natural world. As I straightened up, my mind was already racing with the possibilities. I knew I had to act fast if I was going to stop this thing before it claimed any more lives. But as I turned to leave the morgue, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. As I left the morgue, the weight of what I had just seen settled heavily on my shoulders. The insectoid mutations and the sheer brutality of the attacks suggested a level of malevolence that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to act fast. The longer I waited, the more time this creature had to spread its infestation. I drove out to the meteorite crash site, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. How had this creature arrived on Earth? What was its true nature? And most importantly, how could I stop it before it was too late? As I trekked through the dense wilderness, following the coordinates I had obtained from local authorities, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The only sound was the crunching of dried leaves beneath my boots and the occasional distant caw of a crow. The air felt thick and heavy, as if even the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. And then I saw it. A trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, leading off into the heart of the woods. I followed the path, my senses heightened and my body tense with anticipation. And as I pushed through a dense thicket of brambles, I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The meteorite lay at the center of the clearing, a jagged, obsidian-black rock that seemed to absorb the very light around it. But it was what surrounded the meteorite that truly horrified me. A writhing, pulsating mass of insectoid life. Some were still recognizably human, their bodies twisted and deformed by the strain's influence. Others had fully embraced their new forms, their once human features replaced by chitinous exoskeletons, razor-sharp mandibles, and multifaceted eyes that glittered with malevolence. I had barely a moment to process the horrifying sight before they were upon me. They moved with a speed and agility that belied their twisted forms, scuttling across the ground and leaping from the branches of trees with a sickening grace. I raised my weapon, a modified assault rifle loaded with armor-piercing rounds, and opened fire. The sound of gunfire shattered the eerie stillness of the clearing, their bodies riddled with bloody holes. But they kept coming, a relentless tide of chitinous horrors that seemed to only grow in number with each passing moment. I backed away, firing as I went, but I could feel the creatures closing in on me from all sides. One of them lunged at me, its razor-sharp claws slashing at my face. I felt a searing pain as the creature's talons raked across my cheek, leaving deep, bloody furrows in their wake. I drove my elbow into the creature's face, feeling the satisfying crunch of chitin as it reeled away. But there were too many of them, and I was quickly becoming overwhelmed. I felt my rifle click empty, and in that moment of distraction, one of the creatures tackled me to the ground, its weight driving the air from my lungs. I felt its hot, fetid breath on my face as it loomed over me, its mandibles clicking together in a grotesque parody of laughter. I reached for my knife, but the creature was too fast. It lunged forward, its jaws clamping down on my shoulder with a sickening crunch. I screamed in pain, feeling the creature's razor-sharp teeth tearing into my flesh. With a burst of desperate strength, I managed to drive my knife into the creature's eye, feeling a hot gush of blood as the blade sank deep. The creature reeled back, screeching in agony, and I managed to scramble to my feet. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the sounds of the Chimera strains pursuing me through the undergrowth. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut behind me. I knew that I had barely escaped with my life, and that the true horror of the Chimera strain was only just beginning to reveal itself. As I sped away from the crash site, my mind raced with the implications of what I had just witnessed. It was a hive mind, a collective intelligence that adapted and evolved with each passing moment. And if I didn't find a way to stop it soon, there was no telling how far it might spread or what devastation it might unleash upon the world. As I fled from the nightmarish scene at the meteorite crash site, my mind reeled with the implications of what I had just witnessed. The Chimera strain was more than just a mindless infestation. There was something deliberate and sinister at work here. A hidden agenda that I had only just begun to uncover. I knew I needed answers, and I knew where to start looking. I had spent years cultivating a network of informants and contacts within the shadowy world of government, black ops, and secret scientific experiments. If anyone had information on the Chimera strain, it would be them. I made a series of encrypted phone calls and sent out carefully worded emails, calling in every favor and pulling every string I had. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, one that was even more terrifying than I had initially believed. The Chimera strain, it seemed, was no accident. It had been created in a lab, the result of a series of illegal and unethical experiments conducted by a rogue scientist with ties to the military-industrial complex. The meteorite had simply been a convenient delivery mechanism, a way to test the strain's effectiveness in the field. But the conspiracy didn't end there. As I dug deeper, I began to uncover a web of lies and deceit that stretched all the way to the highest echelons of power. The Chimera strain wasn't just a biological weapon. It was a tool of control, a way for the powers that be to manipulate and dominate the masses. I knew I had to get closer to the source, to infiltrate the very heart of the conspiracy if I was going to have any chance of stopping it. And so, armed with little more than my wits and my determination, I set out to track down the rogue scientist behind the Chimera strain. The journey was a perilous one, filled with close calls and narrow escapes. Every step of the way, I felt the eyes of the conspiracy upon me, watching my every move and closing in from all sides. I was forced to go deep underground, relying on a network of safe houses and secret identities to stay one step ahead of my pursuers. But finally, after weeks of careful planning and dangerous maneuvering, I found myself standing outside an innocuous-looking building on the outskirts of a major city. This, my sources had told me, was where I would find the scientist and the truth behind the Chimera strain. I made my way inside, my heart pounding in my chest as I moved through the deserted hallways. As I turned a corner, I found myself face to face with the man himself, Dr. Alistair Blackwood, the mastermind behind the Chimera strain. He was a tall, gaunt figure, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. And as he spoke, his voice was cold and clinical, devoid of any human emotion. "Welcome, Mr. Moore," he said, a thin smile playing across his lips. "I've been expecting you." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the true extent of the conspiracy. Dr. Blackwood wasn't just a rogue scientist. He was a key player in a much larger game, a pawn in a shadowy war that had been raging for decades. And as he began to reveal the true nature of the Chimera strain, a project known as Prometheus, designed to create the perfect human-insect hybrid supersoldier, I felt a sense of horror and revulsion unlike anything I had ever known. But even as Dr. Blackwood gloated about the success of his experiments and the imminent rise of a new world order, I knew that I couldn't let him succeed. The Chimera strain was an abomination, a perversion of everything that made us human. The confrontation with Dr. Blackwood was only the beginning, a single battle in a much larger war. But as I stood there, facing down the architect of the Chimera strain, I knew that I had no choice but to keep fighting, no matter the cost. The fate of humanity itself hung in the balance, and I was the only one who could tip the scales in our favor. As Dr. Blackwood's words echoed in my ears, I felt a sense of dread settle over me like a suffocating fog. The true scope of the Chimera Strain project was beyond anything I had ever imagined. A twisted plan to reshape the very fabric of human evolution, to create a new breed of super soldier that blurred the lines between man and insect. I knew I had to stop it, no matter the cost. But as I looked into Dr. Blackwood's cold, calculating eyes, I realized that I was up against an adversary unlike any I had ever faced before. This was a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft, a brilliant but utterly insane scientist who saw human lives as little more than raw material for his experiments. I tried to reason with him, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might still lurk within his twisted soul, but it was no use. Dr. Blackwood was a true believer, a fanatic who saw the Chimera strain as the key to unlocking a new era of human evolution. And so, with no other choice left to me, I made my move. I lunged forward, my fists clenched and my heart pounding in my chest, but Dr. Blackwood was ready for me. With a speed and agility that belied his age, he dodged my blow and delivered one of his own, a vicious strike that sent me reeling backward. I stumbled, my vision blurring as I fought to stay conscious. But even as I struggled to regain my footing, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I spun around, my hand reaching for my weapon. But it was too late. A group of heavily armed guards burst into the room, their weapons trained on me with deadly precision. And at their head was a figure I recognized all too well. Colonel Marcus Graves, the shadowy military officer who had been pulling Dr. Blackwood's strings all along. I knew I was outmatched and outnumbered, but I refused to go down without a fight. I charged forward, my body fueled by a desperate primal rage. I managed to take down two of the guards before they overwhelmed me, their fists and boots raining down on me in a relentless barrage. As I lay there on the cold concrete floor, my body broken and my spirit battered, I heard Colonel Graves's voice cutting through the haze of pain. "You should have stayed out of this, Moore," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into. The Chimera Strain is just the beginning, a single piece in a much larger puzzle. And now that you know the truth, we can't let you leave here alive. I felt a surge of fear and despair wash over me as the reality of my situation sank in. I was trapped, beaten, and alone, at the mercy of a conspiracy that stretched to the highest levels of power. And as the guards dragged me away to some dark, forgotten cell, I couldn't help but wonder if I had finally met my match. But even in that moment of despair, I refused to give up hope. I knew that the Chimera Strain had to be stopped, no matter the cost, and I knew that somehow, some way, I would find a way to escape this nightmare and finish what I had started. As I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing with possibilities and plans, I suddenly remembered a critical piece of information that Dr. Blackwood had let slip during our confrontation: the location of his hidden underground lab, where the final stage of the Chimera Strain project was set to be unleashed. I knew that if I could just find a way to get to that lab, I might still have a chance to stop the conspiracy before it was too late. But as I lay there, my body racked with pain and my mind clouded with doubt, I couldn't help but wonder if I was already too late. If the Chimera Strain had already spread too far, and if the world as I knew it was already lost. The thought was a chilling one, but I refused to let it break me. After my brutal confrontation with Dr. Blackwood and Colonel Graves, I found myself locked in a cold, damp cell deep within the bowels of the facility. The weight of my failure hung heavy on my shoulders as I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of the Chimera Strain and the terrible fate that awaited the world if I couldn't find a way to stop it. But I refused to give up hope. I was a survivor, a fighter, and I had been in tough spots before. I knew that if I could just keep my wits about me and look for an opportunity, I might still have a chance to turn the tables on my captors and escape. As the hours dragged by, I studied every inch of my cell, looking for any weakness or vulnerability that I could exploit. And then, just when I was starting to lose hope, I noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the concrete wall, hidden behind a rusted metal panel. With a surge of renewed energy, I set to work, using every ounce of strength and ingenuity I possessed to widen that crack and loosen the panel. It was slow, painstaking work, but I refused to give up, even as my fingers bled and my muscles screamed in protest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to pry the panel loose and squeeze my way through the narrow opening behind it. I found myself in a dimly lit maintenance corridor, filled with pipes and wiring and the hum of machinery. I knew I had to move quickly, before my absence was discovered. I crept through the corridors, using every scrap of stealth and cunning I had learned in my years as a monster hunter to avoid detection. I had to take out a few guards along the way, using my bare hands and whatever makeshift weapons I could find to dispatch them silently and efficiently. As I made my way deeper into the facility, I overheard snatches of conversation and glimpsed snippets of computer screens that confirmed my worst fears. The Chimera Strain was on the verge of being unleashed, and time was running out to stop it. I finally managed to steal a key card from a fallen guard and make my way to a service elevator that led to the surface. As the doors closed behind me and the elevator began to rise, I felt a grim sense of determination settle over me. I knew that the odds were stacked against me, that I was one man against an entire conspiracy of mad science and military might. But I also knew that I was the only one who could stop the Chimera Strain before it was too late. And so, as the elevator doors opened and I stepped out into the cool night air, I set my sights on the hidden underground lab where the final stage of the project was set to be unleashed. I knew that whatever horrors awaited me there, I would face them head-on, with every ounce of strength and courage I possessed. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and I was the only one who could tip the scales. It was time to finish this, once and for all. As I made my way deeper into the heart of the underground lab, the weight of what was at stake settled heavily upon my shoulders. The fate of the entire world hung in the balance, and I was the only thing standing between the Chimera Strain and total annihilation. The facility was a labyrinthine maze of dimly lit corridors and cavernous chambers, each one filled with the stuff of nightmares. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of the twisted experiments that had been carried out here: broken containment tanks, shattered equipment, and the grotesquely mutated remains of failed test subjects. But it was the chimera strains themselves that truly horrified me. They lurked in the shadows, their insectoid forms skittering and chittering in the darkness. I could feel their malevolent presence all around me, a palpable sense of hunger and rage that made my skin crawl. I gripped my weapons tightly as I moved forward, my senses heightened to a razor's edge. I knew that the slightest mistake, the slightest hesitation, could mean the difference between life and death. And then, without warning, they were upon me. A horde of chimera strains, their bodies twisted and mutated beyond all recognition, surging forward in a tide of chitinous horror. I met them head-on, my guns blazing and my heart pounding in my chest. The battle was a nightmare of blood and violence, a desperate struggle for survival against an enemy that knew no fear or mercy. I emptied clip after clip into the onrushing horde, my bullets tearing through their exoskeletons and splattering their ichor across the walls and floor. But even as I fought with every ounce of skill and strength I possessed, I could feel myself being driven back, my ammunition running low and my body pushed to the brink of exhaustion. The chimera strains were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, and I knew that I couldn't hold out forever. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, I saw it. A massive, pulsating mass of flesh and chitin that could only be the Chimera Strain Queen. It towered over the other strains, its body a grotesque fusion of human and insect, its eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. I knew that if I could just reach the Queen, if I could find a way to destroy it, I might still have a chance to stop the Chimera Strain before it was too late. But as I fought my way closer, I found myself face to face with an all-too-familiar figure. Dr. Blackwood, his face twisted into a mask of rage and madness. "You fool!" he screamed, his voice barely human. "You cannot stop the future. The Chimera Strain is the key to unlocking the next stage of human evolution, and I will not let you stand in the way of progress." He lunged at me, his body moving with a speed and agility that no ordinary human could match. I met his attack with a flurry of desperate blows, my fists and feet lashing out in a primal fury. We fought like demons, our bodies locked in a deadly embrace as we struggled for dominance. I could feel the Queen's presence looming over us, a malevolent force that seemed to spur Dr. Blackwood onto even greater heights of savagery. But even as I fought with every ounce of strength and skill I possessed, I could feel myself weakening, my body battered and bruised from the endless onslaught of the Chimera Strains. And as Dr. Blackwood's hands closed around my throat, his fingers digging into my flesh with an inhuman strength, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Was this how it was going to end? Was I really going to die here? In this nightmare of twisted science and eldritch horror, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. But even as my vision began to blur and my lungs screamed for air, I refused to give up. With a final desperate surge of strength, I managed to break free from Dr. Blackwood's grasp and stagger towards the Queen, my hands scrabbling for the explosives I had brought with me. I knew I had only seconds to act, knew that the fate of the entire world rested on my shoulders. And as I looked up at the Queen's massive, grotesque form, I felt a grim sense of resolve settle over me. I would stop this abomination, no matter the cost. I would put an end to the Chimera Strain once and for all, even if it meant sacrificing my own life in the process. With a final, desperate cry, I leaped towards the Queen, my fingers clutching the detonator that would unleash the explosives and hopefully destroy this horror before it could spread any further. But even as my thumb came down on the button and the world erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that the Chimera Strain had already spread too far, and that the nightmare I had unleashed upon the world was only just beginning.